Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's iteration of our threat briefing. Today, we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the cyber security breaches survey issued by DCMS, and also provide a little bit of an update on a couple of other things that have been around in the threat news over recent weeks. As usual, I'm joined by Hugh, one of our senior security consultants. Hi, Hugh.
Hi, everyone.
So we're going to start by talking about the cybersecurity breaches survey. For those of you that are not familiar with this, so it's commissioned by DCMS, so Department for Digital Culture, Media and Support, on behalf of or as part of the National Cyber Strategy. It contains a load of useful information around sort of what organisations are thinking about cyber threats, about how they're responding to those, and how they're generally dealing with cybersecurity. So we're going to drop a link to it into the chat so you can go and have a better read. It is interesting. There are lots of things in there that Hugh and I guess, want to pull out. So let's start at the beginning, Hugh. Let's start by pulling out, I guess, what were your key takeaways from this year's review, and what did you, I guess, think about the kind of data that gets contributed into these from the survey?
So I guess that there's a lot of the sort of things that we grown to expect over the last few years. So I think they said 83% of organizations have said that in incidents they've had, phishing has been the initial attack vector. As we've mentioned on previous iterations, technology and process are improving very quickly across the industry. So people are still the easiest way in. They say that 21% of people reported that the initial access was through another more sophisticated means, and they've listed here denial of service, malware, or ransomware. Now, I thought that was quite interesting because typically, malware or ransomware would also be delivered through that phishing attack. So I couldn't find in the meat of the breaches survey there what the delivery method for that was and why they called it out as a distinct method. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, obviously, the organisations that are surveyed as part of this are obviously split into different categories. That maybe the differentiation was to cope with the differences in the size of the business, or potentially through they separate out charities as well. So maybe there is some meaning behind separating them. But I think from my perspective, you're right. It is interesting that they're potentially seeing an increase in phishing attacks. No surprise there, but also that they're reporting that there's other more sophisticated means that are bringing in external threats. I think some of the other common things that I wasn't surprised by was obviously the statistics around sort of the continuation of cyber attacks. Really, I think the statistic is on par with last year, around about 40% of organizations have suffered a data breach or a cyber attack within the last 12 months, which I guess is to be expected, really. But what were some of the other points that I guess you found interesting within some of the kind of further on chapters for specifics?
Yeah, so I guess one key thing around ransomware that I thought was really quite interesting. Obviously, it's great that the organizations are starting to have these specific ransomware related policies, as it is, obviously something that's a real plague at the moment. The fact that 56% of organizations have a policy that they will never, under any circumstance, pay a ransom struck me as slightly odd, and I'd argue potentially too rigid. Obviously, the government always advised, that you shouldn't pay the ransom because when you are funding serious organized crime, and you're just passing the buck on to the next guy. But I think to have a policy that so specifically says we will never pay a ransom, if you've lost your backups, you've lost all method of recovery, all your business critical systems are down, but the attacker's only asking for £100. That seems to me to be an obvious choice. And I guess the point is, what's the point of having such a rigidly defined policy if in a situation like that, any organization is just going to decide to divert from it?
Yeah, this is an interesting point. A lot of the discussions that we have with organisations around sort of preparation for that, would lead them to make more of a business-led decision on whether it's, if you put the ethical nature of it to one side, I think the financial side of it, can sometimes, give an organisation real thought around the cost benefit of paying a ransom versus the potential cost of rebuilding or recovery, serious recovery of some of their systems. So yeah, I think that is interesting. And I think also interestingly alongside that, I noted a couple of bits around the use of managed service providers and kind of the understanding of third parties in the supply chain. There are a lot of organizations that use managed services and outsourcing, and the breaches survey seemed to indicate that there was more risk through using managed services and outsourcing than potentially insourcing and managing things yourselves. So what's your view on that, Hugh?
So I think that's a really interesting point and potentially a statistical anomaly. Obviously, this is a survey, right? So it's all self-reported. But the fact that they do specifically say there's a higher incidence among organizations that have commercial agreements with managed service providers is odd. So all I can think is that as it is self-reported, people that organizations that are not so mature, don't quite have the right personnel or process in place to maybe identify when a breach has occurred. Then that doesn't necessarily mean they haven't been breached. This could be multiple organized crime groups sitting in their network right now, but they don't realize it, and so they say there hasn't been an incident. But those organizations that have developed those commercial relationships with MSPs, great, they're now spotting these things more regularly. Even smaller incidents, they're identifying them, triaging them, and they have that logged, and so therefore it does get reported. I would be surprised if by virtue of having these MSPs, you were actually in reality at more risk.
Yeah, I'd be equally surprised. But I think, moving on through some of the rest of the report, some of that is contextualized a little bit more, particularly with supply chain. There was a significant portion of businesses that had reported that they don't have the time, the cost, or the expertise to actually assess risks through their supply chain. So I guess you could really look at that in two ways. You could either look at that in the sense that they don't understand what their supply chain risk looks like, but equally, if they are in a position where they don't understand what the risks in their supply chain are, then to some degree, a managed service provision from a third party that is contracted to deliver services to them is probably actually going to put them in a slightly better position. Obviously, they're still going to be expected to manage risks, but if they have got big gaps within their supply chain risk management approach, then MSPs to some degree could help them to almost fill those gaps and sort of try and minimize the potential exposure to them as well.
Yeah, I mean, 100% right. So as with everything, it's the unknown unknowns that really get you. And by bringing on an MSP, I think it was 13% of organizations that were reported as actually undertaking some sort of third-party risk management process. It's a huge undertaking, right? Where would you start if it's not something you've got any foundation in? It's a big task. So getting a managed service provider on board to help with that, they're going to be able to identify the things that you wouldn't have even considered and help put that program together, which is going to have a huge impact. I mean, it's on the NCSC's 10 steps, which are the most basic building blocks of things that we need to be doing. And for only 13% of organizations to have actually considered the very foundational elements, just really goes to show how important it is to get on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that maybe goes a long way to answering that, section 3.2 starts talking about the involvement of senior management. And the disparity, I think, between kind of the level of involvement across the different sizes of organization, may lead to that kind of lack of buy-in and input from senior management teams in actually understanding and driving that risk profiling within the supply chain. A very small number of organizations are actually having regular conversations with senior management teams around cyber threats, which I think, given the last couple of years and the sort of increase in attacks that we've seen and that the statistics here seem to indicate, still seems to be quite an immature position for organizations not to be engaging senior stakeholders with understanding, cyber related risks to the business.
Yeah, and I think also that section of the report was interesting because it was one of the areas that had the greatest sort of banding discrepancy between different organizations. So charities were, significantly less likely to be involving senior leadership with cyber risk. And as we saw, we put some content out not that long ago about the Scottish Mental Health Charity. Charities definitely are targets, so it's not a case of we don't need to have that level of involvement because it's not going to happen to us. Across sectors as well, so finance and insurance were proving a lot better for getting that stakeholder awareness and senior leadership buy-in. But yeah, it just surprised me the level of disparity that there was there, and who are these organizations, right, that don't have these conversations? I guess from our perspective in the industry, we're only seeing the clients that do involve in that process. So it sort of shocked me a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, the finance sector, I guess, has more to lose, and they are potentially higher profile targets. Therefore, I guess we'd expect to see a little bit more maturity. I think what was nice to see is that the trend of providing cyber awareness was increasing across all of the different sizes of organizations, with the majority of organizations now providing some level of cybersecurity awareness training to staff and to contractors, across the board, which was nice to see because, you alluded earlier to, the increase in phishing attacks. One of the key controls that we can put in place is good user awareness. It's also another one of the foundational building blocks for cyber essentials and the 10 basic steps to security. So I think that is nice to see that organizations are, empowering their staff by giving them better awareness of some of the threats out in the real world, and potentially why those organizations are a target as well.
Yeah, I think personally there's two things that we might see in the next few years in the user awareness and training space, and that I think that'll either be a downturn in this. I think we might be at the top of this trend of percentage of organizations getting involved as people become more accustomed, and it becomes more routine. A lot of organizations, they have these e-learning platforms where they get a video, explain a video sent out, and people just click through. I think once people have gone through this on this annual cycle a few times, that buy-in might wane a bit. Or I think we'll start to see, obviously the approach I'm hoping for is more involved, more interesting ways of delivering that user awareness and training. I think gamification around phishing training is really good. Something that I've seen organizations do in the past is flip it on its head, is talk to employees and train them how to phish someone. So set up an environment where people need to ring up a help desk and try and get a password reset. That's really good fun, and you teach them all the red flags, and you have to get them to weaponize those red flags, to successfully phish the person on the help desk. And making it engaging and gamified like that really gets everyone to take that message on board, and it's not something you forget, and it's something you enjoy doing instead of just left clicking through, while you're sort of just having a 10-minute coffee break.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable, isn't it? I think over sort of my various years of experience in delivering, developing, various sort of awareness sessions, the more interactive you can make that, the more likely people are to retain that knowledge, and actually think about sort of what those red flags are and what they should be doing about them, which is obviously far more important. I think on the flip side of that, though, there were some statistics that stood out to me around organizations' reliance on technology and particular security tooling to help them identify and manage cyber threats as well, which I guess, unless you're at a very mature kind of cybersecurity posture, can be quite dangerous to rely on just tooling to tell you what's going on. I mean, obviously you test these things every day, Hugh. What's your thought on the balance between these various pillars of securing an organization, and why do you think people are leaning more towards technology?
Marketing's really good, I think. That these vendors have invested a heck of a lot of money in their security tooling, and then they're really quite good at selling it. I think personally, the high end security tooling is really what comes at the end once you've got the people in the process nailed, or you outsource that to an MSP who are gonna handle that whole package for you. We see it time and time again where people have invested significant amounts of money in next generation XDR services, but if you don't know what you're looking for, those triggers aren't set up correctly, the logs aren't being ingested to the right place, triaged, sent to the right person, it just doesn't work. It's really easy to either miss things or flood yourself with far too many alerts. So anyone in a SOC's got a billion things to look at a day. It's not an easy job. They're not just plug and play, unfortunately. And that is a really common pitfall, I think, especially in the cloud. Organizations think, great, so the cloud's fantastic for the native logging and monitoring options, right? You can enable CloudTrail, CloudWatch, all of those services. But I think organizations don't sometimes quite understand what specifically that's looking for. So great, that's looking for changes in your cloud environment. If resources have been, access to resources has been granted, has this resource been made public? Has it been deleted, modified? It doesn't tell you the health of inside those resources. So you might have an EC2 instance or a virtual machine, and it will tell you what's happening to that virtual machine, but not what's happening in that virtual machine. It won't tell you necessarily, unless you're using something like AWS Inspector, it won't tell you, specifically the software that's inside that and the health inside. And it's a big challenge, right? So you can't just take the tooling and hope that it works without really understanding the problem that you need it to solve.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that ties into one of my next points, which is around cybersecurity strategies. Significantly more organizations, particularly from kind of mid-tier upwards, they're considering far more of their cybersecurity strategy now, with particular focus on cyber insurance, which to some degree, I think I was quite surprised at. I have a lot of conversations with clients around cyber insurance and around what that would mean for them. And a lot of that comes back to a minimum kind of level of security. But it seems that organizations across the board are now considering including cybersecurity cover as part of their wider insurance policies. Do you think that's because they've maybe been subjected to more cyber attacks over the recent years, or do you think that's in preparation for the way that the industry and I guess the threat actors are going as we move forwards?
I think it's the sign of a shift, right? We have sprinkler systems, we have fire extinguishers in our offices, yet we've still got buildings insurance. We don't say, oh, we've got these controls, so we don't need the insurance. And likewise, we don't say we've got the insurance, so we don't need these controls. I think, if nothing else, the fact that these policies exist and the requirements around them. So a lot of them, the insurance companies will mandate that you have regular testing or some baseline level of accreditation before giving you the policy. If nothing else, the fact that these organizations are being forced to take these steps in order to get that insurance policy, I think is a great thing.
Yeah, I think there's a couple more points. I'm conscious of time, but looking at outsourcing of cybersecurity, within the survey, nearly 40% of companies, and 30% of charities are actually outsourcing some aspect of their cybersecurity function now, with the highest, unsurprisingly, being within larger organizations and within the finance and insurance sector, which as we said earlier, I think is an indication that they're higher profile targets and potentially more concerned about their cybersecurity. But where does that leave us with smaller organizations who are still representing probably somewhere between 35 and 50% of their functions are outsourced for cybersecurity? Do you see that as a shift where organizations find it easier to outsource rather than insource? Do you think it's a cost thing? Where do you think the benefit is for organizations to do that, having already sort of noted earlier on in the report that using MSPs and external parties can potentially increase the risk of risk of exposure for the organization?
Yeah, I think it's probably quite analogous to the cloud and the elasticity and scalability there. Fingers crossed, many people in your security function won't be necessary all of the time. I think that's where you get the benefit of that MSP, is that when you need that resource on hand to help you to respond to something, all hands on deck, everyone's there. You've got absolute experts in their field who wouldn't come cheap at all to employ on a full-time basis, at your fingertips, ready to work with you. I think for small organizations, MSPs absolutely are the answer. It would be in most cases cost prohibitive to try and insource all of that. Managing the training of the staff, the ongoing development, none of that's your concern with an MSP. You can see what the qualifications they've all got, happy that they know what they're doing, the service they're offering you, and any good MSP will make sure that onboarding process is done in a good way that actually gets you set up properly and ingesting the right information.
Yeah, all great points. I think the last point I wanted to draw attention to, I guess, was around breaches or attacks and the potential impact of them. I found a really surprising stat that obviously we talked about around the kind of average cost of a cyber attack. It's no surprise that the number one kind of attack vector that most people reported was phishing or social engineering. But an average cost of under £4,500 to deal with a cyber breach, I mean, that to me seems very low. A lot of organizations that we're talking to regularly are just the internal cost of triaging the issue would potentially cost more than that. I mean, what's your view on what makes that number up?
Yeah, so I've been trying to do some digging into the technical annex and how they came to that figure. I don't understand. I can't see how, because this wasn't even the average cost of a breach, right? It was the average cost of security incidents over a 12-month period. So I initially thought, if this is the average cost of a security incident and people are reporting being subject to a denial of service attack for 5 seconds a day, then okay, that would bring the cost down. But no, it's the rolling cost in a 12-month period. So I simply don't have an answer to how that's so low, because I can't envisage any scenario in which an organization that's reported an attack also reports less than £4,300 in a 12-month period.
Yeah, I think from our experience, we'd certainly see the cost of that being significantly higher for the organization, potentially with indirect costs as well for, loss of reputation, loss of data, potential fines. I mean, it seems to indicate that all of those things are potentially included within that average. So I think, for those of you that are interested, Hugh and I are actually going to contact DCMS and find out a little bit more about that and how that is structured. So we'll release something over the coming weeks about that. And you're more than welcome to come and have a read and offer your thoughts into that as well. So I'm moving away then from the cybersecurity breaches survey and onto a couple of other things that have been quite hot in the threat reports over recent weeks. So LAPSUS Group have obviously reared their head again, Hugh, around some of the activities that they've been undertaking. What's your thoughts on their motivations now, and what are they taking advantage of?
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting roller coaster with LAPSUS Group over the last month or so, because they first popped onto the scene and we thought, okay, this is a South American group. They seem to have some APT level abilities. They're quite significant, and yeah, they were hitting a lot of organizations, so that got our attention. Nvidia, Samsung, Microsoft, Okta, Vodafone. Not a list of minor companies that you'd expect to get hit by a group. And then the news started coming out, didn't it? They just posted things on Telegram saying, "Hi, do you work for these companies? We'll chuck some money your way." So really taking advantage of insiders there and initial access brokers to achieve their initial access. So relatively low technical skill. And then the news comes out that actually, no, they're not highly skilled attackers in South America. They're actually just a bunch of teenagers in the UK, which completely threw everyone off. I mean, the people that are working on determining attribution to groups here, these are very highly skilled people who absolutely know what they're on about. And to get it wrong in that way, I thought was quite amusing.
Yeah, and I think groups will continue to kind of act in this way, really, won't they? With a little bit of deception, a little bit of smoke and mirrors, and yeah, I found it equally interesting that they'd managed to kind of disguise themselves for that long, acting as quite an advanced threat actor. And I think one of the other things that I saw more recently in threat news was around sort of recent CVEs, which seem to be bringing up historical issues again, taking us back to the days of, breaches within NHS Digital and across the NHS. What's the news on the most recent CVE, Hugh, and why do you think that those, vulnerabilities around SMB are still around?
Yeah, it is a strange one, right? So we saw the CVE earlier in the month, in SMB. Server message block, and it's bizarre because we've seen so many issues with SMB before, like Eternal Blue, which I'm sure most people are going to be familiar with, and yet still we've got people that so I guess it's not so bizarre that these issues arise because it's a huge bit of functionality, but the fact that people are still getting hit by it, and having publicly accessible SMB is more of a concern, because it's not difficult, right, for a threat actor to now go and find organizations that have open SMB. There are widely available bits of tooling on the internet that you can just sign up for an account for, and you can just like Google, really, you can search for show me machines on the internet that have SMB open that are vulnerable to this exploit, and they're constantly scanning the internet. And it'll just return you a list of search results that of machines that are vulnerable to that. And that's like handed to a threat actor on a plate. So the fact that these misconfigurations and firewalls and things are still so prevalent all these years later, is really quite a big concern.
Yeah, I agree. And interestingly, on that note around misconfiguration. We did have a question come in with one of the registrations around cloud security and around what we feel is kind of the active threats and over the next quarter. I think I already know the answer to that, but what's your view on what the kind of most prevalent threat to cloud environments is now and kind of as we move forwards?
Yeah, and that as it was last quarter, really, it is still misconfiguration. That's across cloud and cloud technologies like container environments as well. We're still seeing things like public S3 buckets and blobs, databases with no authentication on them, Kubernetes clusters, management portals, again with no authentication requirements, publicly available Elasticsearch databases, really what we consider quite basic things that your cloud service provider's own dashboard will probably be giving you a red flag on these items. Then I think it's the problem that it's almost too good now, right? We're going back to that information overload. If you open up your cloud service provider portal, you're almost guaranteed to see a huge long list, everything in red, and you can't see the wood for the trees. Some of those are going to be still okay, better if we don't have them, but of little actual risk to an organization and not providing a direct attack path. But others, like these publicly available buckets where you've got secrets inside and all your sensitive data just publicly accessible, and that is a direct attack path for an attacker. And without that differentiation, it can be quite difficult to identify that. Along with the terminology that is used by a lot of these cloud service providers. So I think we've seen recently people allowing access to resources to authenticated users. That sounds reasonable, right? But unless you realize that authenticated users is users authenticated to that cloud service provider rather than to your organization. So anyone with any AWS account would be considered an authenticated user. So it's misconfigurations like that which pose a huge risk at the moment.
Great, thanks, Hugh. So that's about all we've got time for today. Hopefully you found that interesting. We posted a link to the full report for the cybersecurity breaches survey. Please do go and have a read. If you have any questions, please feel free to connect with Hugh or I on LinkedIn. We'd be more than happy to talk about your thoughts around some of these areas as well. Otherwise, thank you for attending. Have a great afternoon, and we wish you well.
Thanks, everyone.